Part 2, Chapter 25. The silence in the family room was a solid thing. Colville studied the faces of the young men as they sat in the circle waiting. All but one of them, from Alex on his left to Owen on his right, wore the same look, haunted, helpless. All but Reef. Reef's face was empty, as though everything in it had been wrung out. A dishcloth in a dry sink. Everyone waited. The boys had been there that morning when the call came, had seen Colville run to the truck and tear out in the driveway, then returned later with Reeve, or someone who looked like Reeve, the person who sat in the circle with them now, but surely not the person who'd sat there every other evening, his eyes barely masking the bored sneer behind them. This was a different Reeve, hollow, depleted, a body that breathed. Everyone waited. The boys knew some of it, had heard him shouting up on the third floor. Not shouting, really, which would have implied the manufacture of words, more like sounds than speech. Patternless, without form or function. Yet, threaded throughout, had been Frank Colville's low tones, his comments stitching meaning into the torn fabric of that morning. Everyone waited. The sounds had lasted a long time, and then Colville had come downstairs alone. He shook his head when Alex offered to go up. Give him some time, he'd said. After they all had. Morning had become noon, then afternoon, and afternoon had stretched into night. And then Reef had came down. Not the Reef they knew, though. Some other Reef. Everyone waited. And then they didn't have to wait any longer. The other Reef drew a breath, the sound ragged and shallow. Then he spoke. Even before they neared her room, Reeve heard evidence of Lisa's good news. She was singing. Her voice was terrible. Someone more charitable might have called it untrained, and yet oddly beautiful, in the way that storm clouds have beauty. Their tattered edges like dark lace against the lighter sky behind them. She was humming an old Bruce Springsteen song, every few seconds breaking into remembered words and phrases, so the effort was like hearing one side of a conversation. A dialogue between Lisa then and Lisa now. When they reached the doorway, Brett grinned at him broadly and then sped off. Standing there, Reeve could see Lisa in her wheelchair by her locker, putting something into the lower compartment. She was bending at the waist, and a gasp momentarily interrupted her singing as her position put strain on the flesh around her metal pins. But then she continued, Springsteen's lyrics accompanying her task once more. Something else was different. On Lisa's bedside table were framed photographs that had not been there during Reeve's earlier visits. Some of them were photographs of Lisa and another girl, and some were pictures of the girl alone. The girl looked much like Lisa, her hair the same shade of blonde, her smile the same crooked line that suggested an effort to keep from laughing, probably at the antics of the photographer. Ellen, thought Reeve. Hi, he said. Ow. He'd startled her. And turning quickly, she'd bumped her head on the open locker door. But she smiled when she saw the person in the doorway. Reef, she said. What are you doing? He asked. House cleaning. Or locker cleaning, actually. Making room for some more things, she beamed. I'm getting these off tomorrow. She pointed at the medal on her leg. I'll actually be able to wear clothes again. He entered the room and stood by the end of her bed. Brett told me. Must be a relief, huh? You have no idea. Lisa trolled, and she continued more softly. Everyone agrees that I have you to thank for that. Reeve felt his cheeks burn, hotter than salsa this time, stove hot. I didn't do anything, he said. He picked one of the photographs. You look like her, he said gently. We both took after our mom, Lisa explained, which is another reason why I'm glad you're here. My mother wants to meet you. When Reeve glanced around the room, Lisa added, She went down to the cafeteria to get me another milkshake, she shrugged. It's a mother thing. She hasn't been here for a while, and she thinks she has to make up for lost time. She made a face. I've drunk enough milk and eaten enough foods with milk in them to last me a lifetime. When I get out of this place, the first thing I'm going to do is dropkick a carton of 2% as far as I can. As if choreographed, a strawberry milkshake carton fell to the floor in the doorway, a plastic straw oozing pink liquid onto the tiles. Lisa turned to see her mother standing above it, Diane's face as white as the cotton blouse she wore. She looked as though someone had struck her in the stomach, her mouth working oddly yet forming no words. "Mom?" Lisa asked. "What's wrong?" But her mother just stared, unable or unwilling to speak. "Mom, are you going to be sick?" Clearly, this was a possibility as something resembling revulsion flickered back and forth across her mother's face. "You!" she cried. Lisa turned in the direction her mother was looking and saw Reef, his face a darker mirror of her mother's wide-eyed astonishment. "You B-word," her mother shouted. "What are you doing here?" Reef recoiled as if slapped, the backward motion bringing him up against Brett's bed. He dropped heavily onto it. "What's wrong?" Lisa cried. "Do you know each other?" Diane turned to her, her voice shrill and insistent. "Don't you know who this is?" She swung back to Reef. "What are you doing here with my daughter? Haven't you heard her enough? Is this some kind of sick joke?" Footsteps hurried down the hallway and Carly Reynolds appeared in the doorway behind Diane. "Mrs. Morrison, is something—" At the mention of her name, Reef groaned. "Mom," Lisa sobbed. "This is Reef, the one I was telling you about, the one who helped." Her mother shook her head violently. "No," she shouted, and Lisa could hear in her mother's voice an emotion she'd heard only once before. Diane's hands shook as she pointed at Reef. "This is—" and then her voice cracked, and she could not speak. "Mrs. Morrison," said Carly, "what's wrong? Is there something I can do?" Diane turned, as if only now aware of the nurse behind her. Her voice was little more than a croak. "You can get that goddamn son of a bee out of my daughter's room." Carly turned to Reef, who had managed to pull himself to his feet, his shoulders hunched, drawn in toward his body. He looked unsteady, unsure if his legs would support his weight. "Reef?" Carly asked. "Mom, what have you done?" Lisa cried. Her mother reacted as if she'd been slapped. "What have I done?" she managed to ask. "It's what he's done. That." And she paused, groping for words. "That monster is the one who put you here." Lisa looked at Reef. "What is she saying?" She choked. "What does she mean?" "Lisa," Reef began, and then he ran. "And then I ran," Reef said. His voice was little more than a whisper, and the others had to strain to hear him. "I didn't even know where I was going, what I was doing. I didn't even wait for the elevator. Just ran down the stairs. 6 flights, he said softly. His eyes aimed at some point between his feet as he spoke. The others in the room somehow knew he hadn't finished. Wasn't through the telling yet. They waited for him to go on. "I kept running all the way down. I almost fell twice. Wished for a second I would fall." And he stopped. He swallowed audibly, took a breath. "And when I got to the lobby, I ran into the guy who greets people. Slammed right into him. Knocked him clear off his feet. He dragged a hand through his hair, down the back of his neck. I stopped to help him up." He paused. He managed to continue. But he helped me. Called the person in charge, Shelley, who called here." His voice, like an intermittent radio signal, trailed off, became stronger. "I put her in that place. Me. Like Rowdy did to Jink, except Rowdy used his hands. Looked Jink in the face while he did it." He drew another ragged breath. There was nothing more to say, but of course there was more. Far more. "What are you going to do?" Alex asked quietly. Reeve did not look up. He did the only thing he could do. He wept.